The first thing I understood about Alessandro Romano was that silence belonged to him, not the soft kind. Not peace, the other kind. The kind that falls over a room full of armed men in tailored suits when one of them enters and everybody else remembers his own place in the order of things. I was in the upstairs dressing corridor of the Romano estate with a box of emergency sewing supplies, digging into my hip and a loose hem pinned between my teeth when that silence rolled through the house like a weather front. Below me, the engagement dinner went still. Then glasses clinked once, then nothing. Marta De Luca, who ran the house with black dresses and a rosary and the temper of a saint who'd seen too much, had warned me not to wander. Finish the bridesmaid cuffs and go straight back to the service stairs, she'd said. No exploring. No looking for better lighting. No mistakes. I had nodded because people who need extra money nod a lot. The Romano estate smelled of beeswax, cedar polish, and old money, trapped in walls thick enough to outlive wars. I was there because the seamstress from Oak Park had broken her wrist, and because I knew formal wear and invisible hems and how to keep my head down. That last part mattered more. The bridesmaid dress was due back downstairs 10 minutes ago. I rounded the corner with it over one arm and heard footsteps coming too fast behind me. Male. Heavy. Not a servant. I didn't turn immediately. That was another skill poverty teaches you. Measure first. Panic second. Hey, a voice called, slurred at the edges. You're the little tailor girl. I turned then. Corrado Neri stood at the far end of the corridor with his tie loosened and one hand braced on the wall, as if the wall were the drunk one. I recognized him from downstairs only because everyone else had gone slightly stiffer when he laughed. Mid-30s. Broad. Hair slicked back too hard. One of those men who wore expensive suits like threats. I smiled, the careful, empty smile women wear when they want to become less visible than they are. I need to return this dress. You can do that in a minute. The corridor had suddenly become too long. Mr. Neri, Corrado. He came closer. I backed up once, then twice, and my heel struck a door left ajar behind me. Not the service stair. Not safety. Just an open room. Good enough. I slipped through the gap and shut the door softly behind me. The bedroom beyond it was large enough to humble me, all dark wood and pale carpet and a bed that looked untouched by human sleep. Moonlight silvered the edge of a leather chair. A decanter sat on a sideboard beside two empty glasses. The air held a colder version of cologne, as if the room itself had memorized whoever lived in it. Corrado's hand hit the door handle. My pulse lurched so hard, I nearly dropped the bridesmaid dress. There was another door inside the room, half hidden in the walnut paneling. I ran for it. Closet. Huge. Cedar-lined. Dim, except for the strip of warm light from the bedroom outside. Suits and charcoal and midnight hung in perfect intervals. Black shoe boxes. Shelves. Silence. I slipped inside and pulled the door almost shut, leaving a breath of space. Just enough to see out, just enough to breathe. Corrado entered the bedroom. Don't make this difficult. I pressed one hand over my mouth. He moved around the room, opening drawers he had no right to touch. The closet door stayed mercifully still. My heart hit so hard against my ribs I was sure he could hear it. Then my hem dragged across the lower shelf. I looked down. A little white cardigan lay folded there beside patent leather shoes, no bigger than a child's two hands put together. The cardigan had yellowed slightly at the cuffs with age. A pale blue ribbon rested on top of it, carefully coiled. Not discarded. Kept. My wet skirt from the sleet outside had left a dark mark inches from the knit. I don't know why that mattered to me in that moment. Maybe because my father had taught me that clothes keep the shape of love long after bodies are gone. Maybe because the room smelled like cedar and grief. Maybe because terror makes strange things clear. I crouched fast and lifted the cardigan and the shoes to the higher shelf above the hanging jackets, out of reach of my own muddy hem. That was when the bedroom door opened again. Corrado straightened at once. Boss! I couldn't see Alessandro from where I was, only his shadow crossing the bedroom floor, but I felt the room change around him, the kind of stillness that makes other men regret being made of flesh. "What are you doing in my room?" he asked. His voice was low enough that Corrado had to lean into it. That was worse than shouting would have been. Corrado laughed. "Too fast. Looking for you." A pause. Then Alessandra said, "You were looking in my drawers." One more lie. I couldn't see Corrado's face, but I heard the air leave him. "Get out." Corrado muttered something that tried to sound like confidence and failed. His shoes crossed the carpet. The bedroom door shut behind him. The silence after that was different. Focused. I stayed exactly where I was, hands still over my mouth, muscles screaming now from crouching. The closet door opened. Warm light spilled over cedar and tailored wool and me. Alessandro Romano stood there in a black suit with no jacket, white shirt open at the throat, one hand resting on the doorframe as if he had all night and all power and no need to hurry either. His face should have been beautiful in an easy way. It wasn't. Nothing in him was easy. Dark hair, severe mouth, eyes that looked almost black until the light caught amber underneath. His gaze took me in once. The bridesmaid dress clutched in my hand, the panic I couldn't hide, the empty lower shelf, the cardigan and shoes on the upper ledge. Then he looked at Lucia's things, then back at me. I stood too quickly and hit a hanger. It clinked once against wood. "I'm sorry," I blurted. "I was trying to get away from... I didn't touch anything except..." My voice failed me. His eyes dropped to the cardigan above my shoulder. "You moved them." It wasn't accusation. It was observation sharpened to a blade. I nodded because lying felt suicidal. My dress was wet. I swallowed. I didn't want to ruin her things. Something changed in his face. Not softness. Not mercy. More dangerous than either. Recognition, maybe, or some private wound remembering its shape. He stepped into the closet and shut the door behind him. Not fully. Enough. Cedar and wool and the colder trace of him tightened the air around me. He was close now, but not touching. One hand braced above my head against the shelving. He didn't crowd me with his body. He crowded me with certainty. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Were you planning to stay, little mouse?" The name should have humiliated me. Instead, it made every nerve I had go still. I looked at the crack of light at the door, then back at him, until he left. His gaze held mine for a beat too long. Then he reached past me, took the little white cardigan down, and folded it once with care I would not have believed from those hands if I hadn't seen it. When he set it back in place, he said, "You don't leave this room unless I say you do." The lock clicked. By morning, my life had become unrecognizable and somehow more expensive looking. I woke in a bed that could have slept a family of 4, under linen sheets so smooth they felt criminal, with a view of the lake bleeding gray into dawn beyond tall windows I was not sure I was allowed to open. The room smelled faintly of lavender starch and the cedar of the wardrobe against the far wall. My own clothes had been cleaned and pressed overnight. My boots, which I had left muddy by the door, stood polished on a mat as if shame itself had shined them. For 30 full seconds I forgot where I was. Then I remembered the closet. Corrado, the cardigan. Alessandro's hand braced above my head and the low, devastating patience in his voice. I sat up too fast. There was no lock on my bedroom door from the inside. From the outside, I suspected there was. A knock came before I could test that. Marta entered carrying the tray with coffee, toast, and the kind of expression women wear when they have already buried better people than you and do not have the energy to dramatize another one. "Eat," she said. "I should go home." "No." I blinked at her. She set the tray down on a writing desk near the window. "I appreciate that you said it early. Saves us time." "What do you mean, no?" "I mean, Alessandro Romano does not keep frightened girls in the North Wing as a hobby. If you are here, there is a reason." The coffee smelled dark and perfect. I hated the room more for making hunger feel vulgar. I swung my legs off the bed. Marble chilled my bare feet through the thin carpet edge. "What reason?" Marta's mouth flattened. "Last night, Corrado Neri left this house without his phone, his car, or his standing." That did not sound good for Corrado. Strangely, it did not make me sorry. He cornered me in the hall. I know. How? Her brows rose. This house has staff. Some of them even have eyes. I stood and crossed my arms because otherwise I might have folded in on myself. Then you know I was hiding from him, not stealing. Marta looked at me a long moment. If Alessandro thought you were stealing, you would not have woken up in fresh linen. The truth of that made my stomach drop. I tried another direction. My mother will wonder where I am. Your mother has already been called. She was told the roads were bad and you stayed overnight for work. I stared. She shrugged one shoulder. You are not the only woman in this house who knows how to lie for practical reasons. When she left, she took the tray covers, but not the tray knife. I noticed, because fear makes inventory of everything. The north wing corridor outside held silence thick enough to hear the clocks in other rooms. Portraits of dead Romanos watched from gilt frames, with the moral confidence of people who had never had to explain themselves to the living. 2 men in dark suits stood at the far end pretending to admire a vase. Armed, obviously. The house smelled of coffee, wood smoke, and something metallic beneath it that no amount of beeswax could quite disguise. A man came up the corridor carrying a stack of folders. He had olive skin, black hair cut close at the sides, and the kind of compact build that made expensive tailoring look like restraint rather than style. I recognized him from the night before, not Corrado, the other one. The one who had appeared in the corridor when Alessandro stopped me at the door. His gaze flicked to me, then to my bare feet, then to the room behind me. So you're real, he said. I frowned. Should I be offended by that? His mouth twitched. Probably. He shifted the folders to one arm and offered his free hand. Nico Rinaldi. I took it because refusing would have been childish. His grip was warm, quick, careful not to hold. Isabella Conti. I know. That annoyed me on principle. He noticed. Occupational hazard. I know lots of things. What is your occupation? Nico looked down the corridor toward the men by the vase and then back at me, making sure Alessandro stays alive long enough to be difficult. Despite myself, I smiled. Good, he said softly, as if that mattered. Marta was afraid you'd only cry or run. Those seem like reasonable options. They do. He lowered his voice. Do neither until you know where the doors really are. Before I could ask what that meant, the double doors at the end of the hall opened. Alessandro stepped out of the study and the corridor changed temperature. Men straightened. Nico's expression went neutral. My own body betrayed me by noticing too much at once. The rolled sleeves, the dark waistcoat, the way his hands remained empty and still, while every other man in sight adjusted around him. He looked at me, not surprised. Nothing about him suggested surprise visited often. Shoes, he said. I looked down at my bare feet, suddenly stupidly aware of them against the runner. I was in my room. You're not now. I hated how reasonable he made control sound. Marta appeared from nowhere with my boots in one hand and set them at my feet without comment. The leather felt warm from having been near some radiator. I sat on the bench under the portrait and pulled them on while Alessandro stood 3 feet away, speaking softly in Italian to one of the men by the vase. The man answered too fast. Alessandro said nothing for a beat. The man swallowed and corrected himself. That should not have been attractive. Neither should the scent of him when he moved a fraction closer soap, wool, and the air off the terrace, cold enough to feel earned. When I stood, he said, "Come." No explanation. Miko fell into step behind us. The breakfast room was smaller than the dining hall downstairs, all blue silk walls and winter light and silver coffee service on a sideboard. Alessandro waited until the footman left before he spoke. You will stay here until I know whether Corrado spoke about you before he disappeared. I stared at him. Disappeared. His face did not change. That usually means something terrible. Yes. The honesty of it hit harder than a lie would have. I gripped the back of a chair. I have work. You have protection. I didn't ask for protection. No. He moved to the window and looked out at the iced-over fountain. You also didn't ask to be cornered in my corridor. We're well past asking. The words should have frightened me more than they did. Maybe because I was too angry for fear to stand properly. I said, "You can't keep me here because a drunk man made me hide in your closet." At that, his gaze returned to me slowly. "No," he said, "I can keep you here because someone in my house thought he could touch what I had already decided to keep." My pulse tripped once, hard and painful. Nico looked at the coffee service with professional interest. I should have argued. I should have said I was not a coat or a ledger or one of the things his men carried at his command. Instead, I heard myself ask the wrong question. "For how long?" Alessandro's eyes held mine. "Until I say." He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The estate taught me its sounds before it taught me its rules. The soft electric hum of the gate cameras at dawn. The kitchen staff speaking fast, Naples Italian over espresso and olive oil, while the armed men at the back entrance drank theirs in silence. The scrape of chair legs in the study just before Alessandro emerged. The strange, particular hush of the upstairs corridor when he entered it, and every man in it remembered he was not one of them. By the third day, I knew which doors were decorative and which ones locked from the outside. By the third day, I also knew I was not exactly a prisoner. Prisoners are usually easier to define. Marta gave me work because idle hands made me pace, and pacing in the Romano North Wing apparently offended the architecture. I mended table linens, re-sewed loose buttons on staff uniforms, and repaired a velvet evening jacket Nico brought me with a rip at the inner seam. When I turned the jacket inside out, I paused. The seam had been opened before, not by damage. Deliberately. Hand-stitching, fine enough to miss if you weren't looking for it, had once created a narrow hidden channel between lining and shell. My father used to do that, not for ordinary clients, for men who wanted things carried close without pockets showing their shape. I touched the stitches with my fingertip. Matteo Conti had smelled of steam, chalk dust, and cigarette paper he never actually used. He could look at a man once and know whether his left shoulder sat lower because of an old wound, or because he carried too much weight in silence. When I was 12, he taught me how to roll lapels properly and how to tell hand-felled hems from machine finish by touch alone. At 16, he was accused of skimming money through garment invoices tied to Romano shipping contracts. At 16, he died before he could explain. I had spent the years after telling myself that if he were innocent, innocence would have saved him. By noon, that lie had worn thin. Nico found me in the sewing room with the jacket half open on my lap, and my thoughts nowhere useful. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "Maybe I have." He leaned against the doorframe. "Friendly one?" "No." His gaze dropped to the inside seam. "Ah." I looked up. "You knew." "I suspected." He pushed off the frame and crossed the room. Matteo Conti put hidden channels in ceremonial jackets for the old boss. Your father had hands like a jeweler and the survival instincts of a goat in a hunting lodge. I laughed once, despite myself. That sounds unkind. It's affectionate if you knew him. Nico's mouth softened. He once sewed a ledger page into a bishop's garment bag, because he said no one with real guilt would ever let their people search the church thoroughly. The room went still around me. My father had never told me that story. Why are you telling me now? Because Alessandro asked whether you knew what a shadow seam looked like. Nico shrugged. And because whatever is happening around us started before you climbed into that closet. I stared at the jacket lining, then at him. My father didn't steal. No, Nico said. I don't think he did. That answer undid something in me faster than certainty would have. Maybe because it came from a man who lived among liars and still said, I don't think, instead of pretending to know more than he did. He bent and pointed to the inner panel. See this thread, black on black. Your father's choice when he didn't want even the wearer to find the channel quickly. My throat tightened. He always used black for secrets. Nico's hand withdrew. You should tell Alessandro everything you remember. That assumes I remember enough to matter. It mattered the night you moved Lucia's things. I looked up sharply. He regretted the words at once. I could see him decide whether to take them back and choose not to. Lucia, I repeated. Nico exhaled through his nose. His sister. The air in the sewing room changed. Outside, lake wind rattled the panes. Somewhere below, men shouted over the courtyard as a truck reversed on the gravel. She died young, Nico said. That is the house version. The true version stays closer to his bones. I thought of the white cardigan in the closet, the patent shoes lined up like waiting. Before I could ask more, the sewing room door opened. Alessandro stepped in holding a folder and wearing the same unreadable expression he seemed to have been born with. He looked from Nico to the jacket on my lap and understood more than either of us had said aloud. Leave us, he told Nico. Nico did, though not before giving me one look that felt suspiciously like sympathy. Alessandro crossed to the work table. He set down the folder and opened it. Inside lay shipping manifests, harbor invoices, and 3 suit inventory sheets from the year before my father died. He touched one page. You know these markings. I leaned forward. There it was. Black thread notation in the margin where no notation should have been. Not written. Stitched through the paper with a fine tailor's needle. Yes, I said quietly. My father did that when he wanted the message to survive water. Alessandro's face remained still, but the stillness sharpened. What does it mean? I traced the thread with my nail. 3 tiny knots, 1 long pull, then a cut. My father's code for duplicate route, shadow book. 1 version for customs, 1 for truth. It means this manifest had a second copy. Where? I looked at the corresponding suit inventory sheet and felt my pulse kick. Not where, I said. What? His eyes lifted to mine. He hid documents in garment linings, I whispered. If he marked the manifest with thread, the copy was sewn into clothing tied to the same number. Alessandro went very still. The folder smelled faintly of tobacco and old paper. Beneath it, his study of me felt like heat. My wardrobe, he said at last. I nodded. He turned toward the door. Nico. The response came immediately from the hall, as if Nico had been waiting there all along. Maybe he had. Within 15 minutes, we were in Alessandro's dressing room, with 8 suits laid across the bed in orderly darkness, and 3 armed men pretending not to be interested in tailoring. The absurdity would have amused me if the tension in the room weren't so tight. I opened jacket after jacket with a seam ripper, and steady hands that didn't feel like mine. Nothing in the first 2. In the third tuck flat beneath the inner breast lining, I found a narrow folded sheet wrapped in waxed muslin. Every man in the room noticed at once. Alessandro took it from me carefully, as if paper might explode from being handled too roughly. He unfolded it. Read. His jaw hardened by degrees. What is it? I asked. He looked at the page once more before answering. Payment logs. For what? Access. The word sat ugly between us. Nico read over his shoulder and muttered a curse. One of the other men went dead still. Alessandro's eyes moved once over the columns and then landed on a name halfway down the page. Not Corrado. Someone else. Someone close. His gaze lifted to mine, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw the edges of uncertainty cut through all that control. Someone in my house, he said, has been opening doors. That night the house forgot how to breathe. It started with the dogs, 2 of them, somewhere near the east wall, barking in the short, furious bursts that meant movement in the trees. Then the security alarm tripped once and cut out, which was worse than if it had kept going. The wind off the lake came hard against the windows, and a branch scraped the stone outside the north wing with a sound like fingernails. Marta knocked on my door before the men reached the corridor. She was fully dressed, cardigan buttoned to the throat, rosary wrapped around her wrist so tightly her knuckles shone. Come. What happened? Don't ask questions in hallways. I followed barefoot because there hadn't been time for shoes. Marble leached cold up through my bones. The corridor beyond my room held armed men standing too still, and a footman pressed flat to the wall with a face like paper. Italian cut through the air below us. Orders. Positions. One name spoken twice with rising anger. Bruno. Marta moved fast for a woman who claimed her knee had been ruined by Catholic school stairs. She took me down the back passage, past the linen room, through a narrow servant's stair that smelled of starch and candle wax and old stone. The lower chapel sat tucked behind the wine cellar in a part of the house built before Prohibition, and apparently after paranoia. A single red sanctuary lamp burned before a carved Madonna with smoke-darkened cheeks. The room was barely big enough for 2 pews and an altar. The air held incense soaked into stone from decades of private bargains with God. Marta shoved the bolt across the door. Then she turned to me and, because fear makes honest women unkind, said, "If he comes down here and opens that door himself, you stand behind me. He told you to put me here. He tells me many things." Above us, feet pounded once across the hallway, then a shot, distant, muffled by old walls. My stomach dropped and stayed there. "Marta, hush." She crossed herself. I sat because my knees had started doing something unhelpful. Nothing happened for maybe 30 seconds, maybe a year. The chapel lamp flickered. Dust shifted from the arched ceiling with each vibration from above. I could hear my own breathing and hated that it sounded frightened. Then the bolt lifted. Marta had a knife in her hand before the door opened all the way. Alessandro stepped through, saw the knife, and said only, "Really?" She lowered it. "You were late." He looked at me first. Not the altar. Not the room. Me. Bare feet on stone, hair half fallen from its knot, pulse visible, probably, from another county. "Upstairs breach," he said. "False route. Handled." The word handled did not reassure me in the least. Marta drew herself upright. "Then I'll get her back, too." "No." Alessandro's gaze shifted once toward the ceiling, listening to something we couldn't hear yet. "Stay here." He didn't go. That was what changed the air. He shut the chapel door behind him and stood with his back to it, one hand still on the bolt, dark suit unbuttoned, white shirt open at the throat where he'd clearly dragged his tie loose at some earlier hour and never cared enough to fix it. His right cuff was marked with someone's blood. Not much. Enough. I looked at it before I could stop myself. He noticed. It isn't mine. That should not have mattered to me. It did. Marta must have seen something pass between our faces, because she sighed with all the exhausted disgust of a woman who had lived through too many family disasters to respect new ones. "I'm getting water." She disappeared into the little sacristy behind the altar, leaving us in the small red hush. Alessandro moved away from the door and set his gun on the front pew within reach, not because he trusted the chapel, because he trusted his own speed. I was trying not to look at the smear on his cuff, or his hands, or the way the sanctuary lamp painted one side of his face darker than the other. "You should have put on shoes," he said. "I was being chased toward a basement chapel at the time." A line tugged faintly at the corner of his mouth. Gone too fast to call a smile. Then his gaze dropped to my feet again and he crossed the room. Before I understood what he meant to do, he crouched and lifted one of the folded kneeler cushions from beside the pew. He set it in front of me on the floor. I stared at it. "At least be cold more comfortably," he said. "There are gestures so small they shouldn't matter. This one did." I stepped onto the cushion. The velvet was worn smooth in the middle from years of prayer. My toes curled into its warmth. He stayed crouched for 1 beat longer than necessary, close enough now that I could smell the night on him. Beneath his soap and wool, the outside dark scent of a man who had just come in from violence and not yet left it behind. "What happened upstairs?" I asked. He looked at the chapel floor. "Someone used an old service route." "Inside the house?" "Yes." The word fell heavily. I said before caution could catch up. "Bruno." His head lifted. "I heard his name. That doesn't make him guilty." "No." I swallowed. "But you didn't say it was impossible." His eyes held mine in the red lamp glow. I could not tell whether I had impressed him or endangered myself or both. Marta returned with a glass of water and an expression that said the answer might be both. When she set the glass into my hand, her fingers squeezed once. Warning. Comfort. Hard to separate with her. Another shot sounded above us. Then 2 more in faster sequence. My hand jerked. Water sloshed over my skin. Alessandro turned toward the ceiling, and for one instant, only one, something cracked across his face so quickly, I almost believed I had imagined it. Not fear. Memory. The kind that arrives bodily. His shoulders locked. Breath stalled. I saw then, with the humiliating intimacy of intuition, that whatever had happened to Lucia still lived in rooms like this. In bolts. In hiding places. In the number of seconds a loved one spends out of sight before absence becomes catastrophe. Before I could stop myself, I reached out and touched his wrist. Just that. Warm skin, hard tendon, stillness under pressure. He looked down at my hand as if I'd done something more dangerous than grabbing the gun. I should have taken it back. I didn't. He turned his hand over slowly until my fingers rested against his pulse. Strong, fast once, then disciplined back into steadiness. His voice, when he spoke, had gone lower. Isabella. Not warning, not permission, something less useful. The chapel shrank around us. My throat tightened for reasons I refused to name. His thumb moved once against the inside of my wrist and did not leave. Not rough, not accidental. A fraction too long, and then another fraction after that. Marta looked at the Madonna with sudden, professional devotion. Outside the chapel, the house thundered with footsteps, and contained violence. Inside, his hand stayed where it was, and mine did too, and the softness of that in such a room felt more dangerous than the guns. Then the radio at his belt crackled. Boss. East stair secure. The moment broke without mercy. Alessandro released me first. Stood. Took the radio. Gave 2 short orders in Italian and clipped certainty. When he finished, he picked up the gun from the pew. You stay in the north wing tomorrow, he said. I almost laughed. That sounds less like a reward than you think. His eyes flicked once to my mouth. It isn't a reward. At the door, he paused. Then, without turning back, he added, Nothing happens to you in this house without passing through me first. That should have comforted me. It didn't. It changed too much. The world cracked open at lunch over a row of black dresses. Marta had me in the upstairs wardrobe room sorting morning wear for a funeral dinner that had suddenly become mandatory after one of Alessandro's dock captains was found in his car with his throat cut and 2 fingers missing. Messages, Marta said when I asked too much with my face. Men insist on leaving them. The wardrobe room smelled of mothballs, cedar, and expensive wool. It should have been calming. Instead, it felt like standing inside a held breath. I was buttoning the sleeve of a widow's black crepe dress when Bruno Falco stepped into the doorway. He was older than Alessandro by 20 years, silver at the temples, broad through the shoulders in the way men stay broad when other men lift for them. He wore loyalty beautifully. That was part of the problem. I thought I'd find you among the suits, he said. I stood at once. Mr. Falco. Bruno. His smile was gentle enough to alarm me. Up close, something in the line of his mouth snagged at memory. A wet night. Men in my father's shop. A voice downstairs saying, Search the back workroom. I had been behind a rack of half-finished jackets with my hand over my mouth and my mother shaking beside me. Not certainty, just the shape of it. My skin went cold. He noticed. Of course he did. Men like Bruno lived by noticing the wrong things in other people and making them useful. Are you unwell? No. A lie, and a poor one. He stepped farther into the room and his gaze drifted over the wardrobe rails, the black silks, the cedar shelves. Your father used to curse under his breath when these hangers snagged delicate linings. The dress button slipped from my fingers. He saw that too. Matteo Conti, Bruno said softly. Very fine tailor, very bad at choosing his friends. The room tilted around me. How do you know my father? Bruno's face altered by less than an inch, almost pity. My dear girl, I am one of the reasons he stayed alive as long as he did. I stared at him. Then at the wardrobe door. He followed the glance and smiled without warmth. If you scream, the women downstairs will hear something indelicate. I dislike scenes. My voice came back too thin. Why are you telling me this? Because Alessandro was beginning to look where he shouldn't, and you— His gaze dropped to my hands. The needle, the wool, the room itself had become a complication I did not expect. The floor under me felt less solid than fabric ever had. He took one more step. Then Alessandro's voice came from the corridor outside. "Bruno." The older man turned with no visible hurry. Alessandro filled the doorway in black overcoat and gloves, lakewind still on him. His eyes moved from Bruno to me, to the dropped button on the floor. If I had not already learned him badly, I might have missed the shift. The slight flattening of air. The way his right hand came out of his coat pocket empty and stayed empty. "Meeting without me," he said. Bruno smiled. "We were discussing Conti tailoring." "Were you?" The temperature in the room dropped. I should have spoken then. Said I know his voice. Said he was in my father's shop. Said anything useful. Instead, I stood there with the needle still in my fingers, and shame crawling up my throat because certainty is easy from the outside and slippery when it can get a man killed. Bruno touched the wardrobe rail once on his way past. "You should be careful what old seams you open, Alessandro. Some of them are holding up the whole house." Then he left. Alessandro waited until his footsteps were gone before he looked at me again. What did he say? Too late. Too direct. My father had died in part because the wrong truths had reached the wrong men in the wrong order. Fear arrived dressed as caution, and I let it. "Nothing," I said, "about my father." The lie tasted terrible. Alessandro knew. I saw it land in his face and settle there. Not with anger first, but with disappointment, which was worse. He came in and shut the wardrobe door behind him. "You're shaking." "I'm not." "Isabella." That was all. Just my name and that tone that made evasion feel smaller than it was. I gripped the edge of the garment rack. He knew my father. So do I. Alessandro's gaze did not leave mine. That is not enough to make you look at the door like you're measuring distance. Tears rose so fast they made me furious. I hated crying in front of men like this. It always felt like surrender even when it wasn't. He noticed the tears and the anger about them. His face changed by 1 degree only, but with him that was almost tenderness. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and set something on the packing table between us. My father's tape measure. The old leather cracked at the loop, brass worn pale where his thumb had always pressed. I had not seen it since the nightmen trashed the shop. "It was in the hidden pocket of one of my winter coats," Alessandro said. My breath left me. "He left more than manifests." His voice lowered. "He left instructions." I touched the tape measure and something inside me gave way. "What instructions?" Alessandro unfolded a narrow strip of muslin from beside it. Black tailoring thread stitched words into it so tiny I had to lean close. "For Isabella. Trust the hem beneath the cross." My throat closed. The cross. My father's old standing joke for the chapel, embroidery on the Romano family's ceremonial altar linens. The hem beneath the cross. A hiding place. I whispered, "He left something in the chapel." Alessandro watched my face, not the cloth. "And Bruno knew enough to come here before I did." That pulled me back to the present hard enough to hurt. I looked up. "You think it's him. I think he's standing where the light is strangest." He paused. "And I think you knew more than you just said." The accusation was quiet. It still landed. I opened my mouth and closed it again. Because I did know more. Not enough for proof. Enough to matter. Enough to endanger him if I spoke it wrong. Enough to endanger him if I didn't. He saw the war in me and did not press further. That restraint hurt in its own way. At last he said, "Come with me to the chapel." We went by the lower corridor where the walls held coolness even in daylight, and armed men stood every 20 feet pretending to be decor. The little chapel smelled of wax and stone and old apologies. Beneath the altar, linen embroidered with a cross in faded gold, tucked into the hem just as my father promised, was a folded ledger strip listing payments made to dock guards, route clerks, and one name that made Alessandro's jaw set hard enough to show the muscle, Corrado. And below Corrado, another name marked only by initials. "BF," Alessandro read it once. then folded the strip carefully and slid it into his inner pocket. "You lied to me," he said. I looked at the floor. "Only partly." "That still counts." "Yes." When I dared look up, his face was all control again, worse than anger, cleaner. He stepped back from me. From now on, partial truths cost more. Then he walked out of the chapel with my father's last stitchwork in his pocket, and betrayal no longer rumor, but not yet fully named. I stood alone before the altar, feeling the exact shape of my mistake begin. The assassination attempt came in the florist's district at dusk, with freezing rain slick on the sidewalks and the smell of wet cardboard and carnations rotting in alley bins. I should not have been there. Alessandro knew it. Nico knew it. Marta told me so with one look sharp enough to shave skin. But the hidden ledger from the chapel had referenced a garment warehouse on Archer where my father once rented cold storage for imported silks, and Alessandro wanted the old inventory books before whoever was leaking to Vittorio got there first. So I sat in a back seat of the armored sedan with Miko up front and Alessandro opposite me, his dark overcoat open at the throat, one gloved hand braced on a leather folder. Outside, the city slid past in iron-gray reflections. Rain struck the glass in fine, hard lines. The florist's warehouses rose block after block, narrow brick buildings with loading bays and painted signs half peeled by winters. I used to come here with my father for ribbon by the spool and boxes of imported lilies that made the whole car smell like clean funerals. The memory hollowed me out a little. Alessandro looked up from the folder. "What?" I hadn't realized my face had changed. My father used to buy peonies from a man on 21st who only took cash and lies. Nico laughed softly from the driver's seat. Good business model. I almost smiled. Alessandro didn't, but his gaze stayed on me 1 second longer than necessary, reading whatever sat behind the sentence. We stopped outside Warehouse 17. The loading door was rust red, chained but not locked. The alley smelled of diesel, wet concrete, and cold blooms turned sweet in decay. Alessandro got out first. Nico came around my side and opened the door with one hand while scanning the roofs. "Stay close," he said. I hated how quickly I obeyed. Inside, the warehouse was mostly dark. Tall shelving, stacked garment boxes, a busted freight elevator. Every sound echoed wrong, too large and too near at once. Alessandro moved with the economy of a man who had mapped danger into muscle memory years ago. Nico went left. I stayed exactly where Alessandro placed me, behind an old cutting table scarred with blade marks and chalk ghosts. The first shot came from the catwalk above. Glass exploded somewhere high and ugly. Nico shoved me flat behind the table before my brain recognized gunfire. Alessandro was already moving, not diving, not rushing blindly. Cutting angles, returning fire with terrifying precision. A man yelled overhead and hit the metal stairs hard enough to rattle the whole structure. Then 2 more came through the back office door. What happened next was not rage. That was what stayed with me. Alessandro became colder than emotion. He shot one attacker through the shoulder to spoil the aim, crossed the distance, broke the second man's wrist, before the gun fully cleared his jacket, and drove both of them back into the office doorway with movements so efficient they felt pre-written. No flourish. No warning, just consequence. It terrified me, and because human feeling enjoys cruelty, it also made something low and helpless in me tighten around his existence. One of the gunmen saw me. His mouth split in a grin, and he swung the barrel my way. I didn't have time to scream. Alessandro turned at the exact wrong beautiful instant and stepped into the line of fire, taking the man down first. The bullet grazed Alessandro's ribs instead of mine, slicing coat and flesh both. He hardly seemed to notice. Nico did, so did I. Boss later. Blood darkened Alessandro's waistcoat under the open coat front. Rain and sweat and gunpowder sharpened his scent into something colder. He looked over the room, over the fallen men, over the catwalk, and then at me. His face emptied. Not because he felt nothing, because what he felt had gone beyond expression. He came to me. One stride, then another, knelt in front of my crouched body and checked my face, my throat, my arms, as if there could be hidden fractures he might find by focus alone. Where? I shook my head. Words wouldn't work. His bloody glove touched the cut at my temple where shattered glass had kissed me on the way down. A tiny thing, barely even pain. His eyes changed. I saw then what happens to men who survive by control when something small and beloved bleeds in front of them. The stillness does not break. It sharpens until the whole world becomes a narrower thing. Nico turned away, already barking orders into his radio. Alessandra looked at the red on his own glove from my temple, and then, for one sickening second, at the body nearest the table. If the man had still been alive, Alessandra would have taken more from him than death. He stood, held out a hand. I took it because not taking it felt impossible. The ride back to the estate passed in silence except for Nico's radio and the wet hiss of tires. Alessandra sat opposite me with one hand pressed hard to his side beneath the coat. His face had gone pale under the olive cast of his skin, but he never leaned back. At the estate medical room, Nico disappeared to lock down the perimeter. Marta brought antiseptic and bandages with lips pressed thin enough to disappear. When she saw the blood at Alessandra's ribs and the cut at my temple, her eyes closed briefly. Then she put the supplies down and left without comment. The room was small and too bright. Stainless cabinet, examination table, one high window striped with rain. Alessandro took off the ruined waistcoat and shirt with one-handed efficiency that should not have been intimate and absolutely was. The graze along his ribs was ugly, but not deep. Old scars crossed his torso in pale, clean lines. I looked away too late to keep from having seen them. "Sit," he said. "You're bleeding." "Yes. You say that like it's weather? Isabella?" I took the antiseptic anyway. My hands shook once when I touched him. Warm skin, hard muscle, blood slick at the edge of the wound. He did not flinch, which somehow made me more careful, not less. After a moment he said, not looking at me, "It wasn't because you were in my closet." I paused. What? The room smelled of iodine, rain, and the colder trace of him under both. He kept his eyes on the opposite wall as if the truth required distance. "The first night," his voice went lower, "it wasn't that you were frightened, or hidden, or in a room that belonged to me." I wrapped fresh gauze once around his ribs. "What was it then?" He finally looked down at me. "You were shaking so hard you could barely stand," he said, "and you still moved Lucia's cardigan and shoes because you didn't want your wet skirt to stain them." The bandage slipped in my fingers. That, he said quietly, was the moment. Everything in me went still. Outside, rain struck the window in fine, relentless taps. Somewhere in the house a man shouted and was answered in Italian, but in that room it was just gauze between my hands and the impossible steadiness of him saying the thing out loud. "I should be afraid of you," I whispered. His face did not change. "You are." I shook my head before I could think better of it. "No." The word hung there. More dangerous than confession would have been, because it was truer and less complete. His hand came up, slow enough for refusal, and touched the side of my face just below the cut. Not the wound itself, the skin near it. His thumb rested there, warm and careful and at war with something I could feel but not name. I didn't move away. That was my yes before any other yes. "When you were out there," I said, and my voice shook in a way I hated, "I thought if you didn't turn back toward me, I would hear that in my head forever." The sentence cost me. I knew it while it left. His eyes closed once, opened darker. "Isabella," that was all. Then he leaned in. The kiss was not hungry. That would have been easier. It was restrained in a way that made my whole body understand exactly how much restraint was costing him. His mouth touched mine once, lightly, giving me room to refuse what I had already chosen by staying still. I leaned in before my courage could disappear. His hand slid to the back of my neck. Mine caught in the front of his unbuttoned shirt because I had nowhere else to put the shaking. It stayed there, half clutch, half prayer. The kiss deepened by a fraction only, slow enough that I felt every point where he held himself back, and every place in me that answered anyway. When he drew back, his forehead rested against mine and both of us breathed like something harder than running had happened. Then the study alarm began to sound downstairs. Not a drill. Not practice. The low pulsing note of perimeter breach. Nico pounded once on the medical room door. Voss, east wall. Alessandra's eyes stayed on mine for one awful beat more. Then he stepped back, reached for his gun, and became harder all at once. The warmth did not leave his face. It went to war. "It isn't coming anymore," he said. The alarm kept sounding. "It's here." By morning, the estate had split cleanly into before and after. Before, men still used voices. After, they used radios and glances and the disciplined silence of people who expected someone to die if a sentence arrived half a second late. Cars came and went through the gates in hard gray weather. The house smelled of coffee gone bitter on hot plates, leather holsters warmed under jackets, and rain dragged in on expensive shoes. Marta stopped pretending the staff hallways were safe. Nico stopped pretending my movements were incidental. Alessandro stopped pretending he could keep me near without it costing blood. He found me in the greenhouse just after noon, where Marta had put me to clipping dead leaves from the lemon trees, because she said grief should happen while hands are useful. The greenhouse glass was pearl gray with rain. Damp earth and citrus oil filled the air. I had one hand wrapped around pruning shears, and the other clenched too tight around my own thoughts when Alessandro stepped inside. He carried an envelope and a passport. I knew what the shape of both meant before he spoke. "You're leaving tonight." The shears clicked shut in my hand. "No." His expression didn't move. "Yes." For how long? Until Vittorio was dead and Bruno was named properly. The use of Bruno's name startled me. Not because I hadn't suspected, because Alessandro finally had. I set the shears down carefully. "You know it's him. I know enough. Then let me stay." "No." The single syllable hit the glass harder than any raised voice would have. Rain tapped overhead. Somewhere near the door, condensation slid down a pane in slow, cold lines. The lemon blossoms smelled too sweet for the room. He set the envelope on the potting bench between us. "Miko will drive you to Union Station. Marta goes with you as far as Milwaukee. There's an apartment under another name, Cash. Medical numbers. You call your mother only from that apartment. You arranged all this in a morning." "I arranged it last night." That landed where it was meant to. I looked at the envelope instead of him because if I looked at him I might say something humiliating and true. "You've decided." "Yes." "You don't get to do that alone." His eyes lifted to my face. "I already did." The anger that came then saved me from crying. Anger is useful that way. I said, "You think this is protection?" "It is. It feels like being erased." That struck somewhere. I saw it, briefly. The face of the man beneath the boss, then control locked down over it again. "This is what my world does," he said. "It takes anything soft and puts a price on it." I hated the word soft. Hated more that I knew he didn't mean weak. Marta came in before I could answer. Black cardigan buttoned tight, train case already in one hand. Her eyes went from his face to mine and understood too much. She said, "I'll pack for her." Alessandro nodded once and turned away before I could stop him or ask him not to. That hurt more than if he had touched me first. My mistake unfolded an hour later in the North Wing bedroom, while Marta folded my clothes into the train case with the ruthless efficiency of a battlefield nurse. She held up my blue wool dress. "This or the gray. Either. That means blue." I stood at the wardrobe with my hands wrapped around the bedpost because they wanted to shake. On the dressing table lay the envelope, the passport, and the hidden muslin strip from my father's chapel hymn that I had taken from my jewelry drawer because leaving it behind felt like abandonment. That was when I saw the back of it. A second line of stitching I had missed before. Black thread on cream muslin, nearly invisible. I bent closer. Falco wore bishop black the night the shop burned. The room went hollow around me. Bishop black. My father's phrase for the special matte wool he tailored only for Bruno Falco, because the older man hated shine at the shoulder. I had smelled wet wool and pipe smoke that night in the shop, heard a calm voice downstairs, seen the black sleeve through the rack slats where I hid. I knew then, not suspicion, not probability, knew. And I had not told Alessandro I ran. Not gracefully, not with any plan worth respecting. One hand still clutched the muslin strip from my father's hem. The other shoved the train case off the bed so hard it struck the wardrobe and split open at the clasp. Marta shouted my name from the corridor. I did not answer. I was already out the door. Blue dress half-buttoned, heart beating high and stupid in my throat. Bruno wore bishop black the night the shop burned. My father had stitched it for me because he knew memory warps under fear. He had left the truth in thread because thread outlasts panic. I should have told Alessandra sooner. The thought ran beside me all the way down the north corridor. Men turned as I reached the landing. One of them said my name. Another caught my elbow and lost it at once when he saw my face. The house smelled of coffee gone bitter and wet wool dragged in from the gates. Somewhere below, radios crackled in clipped Italian. I saw Nico in the foyer with blood already soaking one sleeve and knew the war had moved faster than my courage. "Where is he?" I asked. Nico looked at the muslin strip in my fist before he looked at me. "South Docks." Of course. A false fire at the warehouse. A route leaked on purpose. Bruno sending Alessandro one way while the real blow landed somewhere else. I took one step toward the front doors. Nico blocked me with the arm that wasn't bleeding. No. He's walking into it. Yes. His jaw locked. "Which is why you are getting in the car and leaving now." Rain slapped the leaded glass of the front doors. The courtyard beyond was a blur of headlights and moving men. My passport envelope sat on the entry table under a silver bowl of winter pears, absurdly neat against the house coming apart around it. Marta came down the stairs behind me, breathing hard. What did she find? I thrust the muslin at her. She read it once and went white. Nico swore softly. The world narrowed. If I left now, I might still survive this. I might take the train. I might become the woman who listened once, obeyed once, and lived small enough for history to lose interest in her. But Alessandro would walk into a trap built partly out of my silence. I looked at the front doors, at the passport, at Nico's bleeding sleeve, at the house that had already taken too much from too many people and still somehow asked for more. Then I said, "I'm not going." Nico stared at me. "Isabella, no." The word shook, but it stayed a word. "You can drag me, but you can't make me leave cleanly now, not when I know." Marta closed her eyes for one beat. When she opened them, there was grief there, and something like reluctant respect. "That," she said quietly, "is the worst answer you could have given, which makes it the honest one." Nico took a breath through his nose and let it out hard. He looked toward the drive, calculating. "Fine, we don't go to the station. We go to the South Docks and intercept." The side entrance exploded inward. Not metaphor, not exaggeration. Wood burst in a shower of splinters and cold rain. Men in black came through the smoke of the charge too fast for the house to fully understand it. One went down immediately under guard fire. Another vaulted the overturned console table. A third I recognized before my mind would let me. Bruno Falco. No grandfatherly calm now. No benevolent old retainer. Rain on bishop black wool. Gun already drawn. Eyes empty of everything except function. Nico shoved me backward so hard my shoulder struck the stair banister. Marta pulled the passport envelope off the table and jammed it into my hand, as if some version of leaving still existed, if she forced it hard enough. "Run," she snapped. I did. 2 steps. 3. Then the foyer filled with gunfire and the marble under my boots turned slick. Nico shot one man at the threshold and took a bullet high in the side a second later. He folded to one knee, swore, shot again. Marta snatched up the brass fireplace poker from the umbrella stand and hit a man across the jaw with both hands on the shaft. The sound of it made me sick. Bruno looked at me through all of it, not shouting, not theatrical, just choosing. He raised the gun toward Nico's head because Nico was between him and me. And Marta stepped in front of the shot. The bullet caught her low in the shoulder and spun her into the newel post. She slid down it in black wool and blood, still trying to lift the poker again. Everything in me stopped. Then Bruno's men were on me. I fought because I could not do anything else and remain myself. Nails, elbows, teeth. One man cursed when I bit through the web of his hand. Another twisted my wrist until the muslin strip fell from my fingers. I saw it land in blood and rainwater at the threshold and knew that if it was lost, some truth would go with it. Bruno came through the chaos as if violence were merely weather and he had dressed for it. He caught my chin in one dry hand. "Your father always did leave instructions for the wrong people," he said. I tried to spit at him. I missed. He almost smiled. Then something hit me hard at the base of the skull. The foyer lurched sideways. I saw Nico trying to stand through the blood, Marta on the floor, lips moving around a prayer or a curse. Bruno's black sleeve, the open front door, rain slanting white through it. The dark took me before I hit the marble. When Alessandro answered Nico's call at the South Docks, he knew from the first breath there was no chance of recovery clean enough to be called relief. Nico, bleeding. Marta hit. Isabella taken, Bruno confirmed. He stood in a warehouse that smelled of river rust and dead fish, and understood, with a cold clarity he would have paid money to avoid, that sending her away had not been protection. It had been a delay, a human one, a doomed one. Men were already moving around him, waiting for orders. He gave them, but the thing settling into his bones had nothing to do with leadership and everything to do with the old closet door in his memory, and the little girl who had once obeyed him until obedience killed her. If he got Isabella back, he would never again confuse distance with safety. If he didn't, nothing in him worth keeping would remain. I woke in darkness that smelled like cedar, dust, and something scorched long ago, but never fully gone. For a moment I thought I was back in Alessandro's closet. Then I felt the rope at my wrists, then the cold floor under my cheek, then the engine noise somewhere below, dull and old, like a generator fighting age. Not his closet. A room built to imitate one. Or maybe not imitate. Remember, my eyes adjusted by degrees. Wooden walls. Garment rails. Trunk stacked too high. A single bare bulb hanging over the center of the floor. Somebody had put me in a dressing room, stripped of softness and bolted from the outside. A closet inside a trap. I sat up slowly. My hands were tied in front, not behind. That was careless, or deliberate. Bruno's voice came through the door a minute later, calm as rain on church stone. "Don't waste your strength, Isabella." I stared at the grain of the wood and said nothing. He continued, "Betrayal will be here soon. Alessandro too, if he still confuses rescue with strategy." A pause. Then, almost gently, "You should pray he arrives in time." Footsteps moved away. The bulb swung once over my head. Cedar breathed around me. And somewhere below, too close to be comforting, I heard men preparing a house to burn. The room had once belonged to a child. I knew that before Bruno confirmed it, not from furniture. There was almost none. Not from color. The wood was dark, the bulb mean, the trunks metal-cornered and old. I knew from the shelf height, from the faded wallpaper strip behind one rail where tiny horses still ran under decades of smoke stains, from the little brass hook at knee level that no adult would have reached for without thinking it absurd. A nursery dressing room turned storage. My wrists were tied with utility cord, the kind men in loading yards keep in their pockets and cut with their teeth. I rubbed the rope against the metal edge of the nearest trunk handle until the skin at the base of my thumbs burned. Not panic. Work. Panic could have its turn later. The house around me creaked in lake wind. If this was the old Romano City house and the smell of old smoke in the wood said it was then, Alessandro had once run these same halls as a boy. Lucia, too. Bruno had not only taken me. He had chosen the room on purpose. I got one hand loose by the time the lock turned. Bruno entered first. Vittorio Savoia came behind him. He was exactly the kind of man newspapers should have warned women about and never did. Elegant, silver at the temples, overcoat cut beautifully, mouth too composed to belong to anyone, who felt normal things at normal volumes. If Alessandro was still water over depth, Vittorio was polished stone meant to impress until you slipped and split your skull on it. He looked me over once, not hunger, worse. Assessment with no moral weather in it. "So this is her," he said. Bruno shut the door and stood at Vittorio's shoulder like an old shadow finally stepping out where it could be seen. I stayed on the floor because standing felt like permission. Vittorio crouched in front of me, with one gloved hand braced on his knee. "Do you know what interested me first?" "It wasn't your father's threads." "Not really. It was Bruno's story about the closet." My stomach tightened. "You were terrified," Vittorio said. "And instead of digging through Alessandro's things or begging when he found you, you lifted Lucia's cardigan out of the mud." He smiled slightly. Men like Alessandro mistake reverence for fate. I wanted to answer with something clever and cutting. What came out was, "You burned his sister." The smile vanished. Bruno's face didn't move at all. Vittorio stood. "No." Bruno opened the service corridor and let the right men into the house. Fire is less personal than betrayal, though I suppose children don't find that distinction useful. The room went so cold I could hear my own pulse. Bruno adjusted his cuff. Lucia was collateral. Alessandro was the target. I lunged before thought could stop me. The rope still looped one wrist, enough for the motion to be stupid and incomplete, but not enough to stop me from getting my shoulder into Bruno's knees. He stumbled back into a trunk hard enough to rattle the brass corners. Vittorio laughed once, low and without amusement. "There's your tailor's daughter." Bruno righted himself and looked at me with something like regret ruined on the way out. "Your father should have taught you when silence was useful." "He did." I got to my knees. "He just didn't mean for your benefit." The slap came quick enough to prove he'd wanted to do it earlier. My head snapped sideways. Copper filled my mouth. I stayed upright anyway because falling would have pleased him. Vittorio moved toward the door. "Keep her breathing." Bruno nodded. When they left, he paused with his hand on the knob and looked back once. "Alessandro will come," he said. "That has always been his flaw." The lock turned. I spat blood on the floorboards and went back to the rope. Alessandro did not roar when he reached the old city house. Men like him rarely waste sound on states. Everyone else can already see. The Romano townhouse stood between two condemned buildings on a street the family had long ago learned not to name in polite company. Its windows were blacked out. One upstairs room held a faint line of light. The front entry showed fresh scuffs in the rain grime. The whole place smelled wrong, even from the curb accelerant under old ash. Nico limped beside him, pale and furious, one arm strapped tight across his ribs. "They want you inside. Personal." "Yes, don't say yes like that." Alessandro looked up at the third-floor window, at the room where Lucia once hid, at the trap Bruno had chosen because he knew exactly which part of the past still had teeth. Then he said, "Take the back stairs. If the roofmen move, kill them first." Nico's jaw worked. "And you, I'm going through the front." That was the cost, not his life exactly. The other thing, the belief that he could remain cold enough to survive without ever again entering the rooms that made him human. He had been wrong. About distance, about protection, about what keeping relics intact could do for the dead. He drew his gun. If Isabella was still breathing upstairs, every lie he'd told himself about restraint would be tested against the sound of her voice. The rope frayed. One strand, then another. By the time footsteps returned, I had one wrist loose and my father's tiny emergency seam ripper out of the lining of my dress. I kept it there because poor girls learn quickly that tools are only useful if men forget they can belong to women too. The door opened. A guard, not Bruno. Thick neck, rain-damp shoulders, gun in his hip, and boredom in his face. "Boss says move." I let him come close. That was the trick with men who thought fear had already finished the work for them. They leaned into your stillness. When he bent to haul me up, I drove the seam ripper into the soft web between thumb and wrist and twisted with everything I had. He howled. The gun came halfway clear. I took the barrel in both hands, slammed it against the trunk edge, kicked his knee, and ran. The hallway beyond was all shadow and old runner carpet and smoke curling low along the ceiling. So Bruno meant to burn it after all. I made the stairs before the second guard saw me. He shouted. I slipped on the polished wood and caught myself on the banister just as a shot splintered the wall where my head had been. Then the front door below exploded inward. Gunfire answered from the foyer. Men shouted Alessandro's name. I froze for one stupid heartbeat on the landing and saw him through the balustrade. Dark coat wet from rain. Gun up. Face stripped of everything except intention. He looked less like a man entering a house than like the thing that enters after men fail to keep theirs safe. One of Bruno's shooters came out of the dining room behind him. I screamed, "Alessandro!" He turned at the sound just as Nico's shot from the rear hall took the man through the throat. Then Alessandro looked up, found me. What happened in his face then was not relief. Relief is soft. This was impact. Proof of life slamming into a body built for damage. "Down!" he shouted. I moved because there are moments when obedience is not surrender, but survival. The stair rail splintered where bullets struck. Smoke thickened. Somewhere above, old wood caught with a hungry crackle. By the time Alessandro reached the landing, both of us were shaking hard enough to pass it between us like fever. He took my face in both hands first, counted bruises with his eyes, counted breaths. Then he pulled me into him with a force that hurt and steadied at once. No words. His coat was wet, his heart beat too fast. My fingers gripped the back of it, because if I let go before I had to, the house might decide none of this was real enough to keep. Nico's voice carried through the smoke from below. "Bruno's gone up, roof access." Alessandro drew back just enough to look at me. Blood at my lip. Rope burn on my wrists, fear and something else in my face that I could not have named if you had paid me. "Can you walk?" "Yes." It came out ragged and angry. "Good." He put one hand at the back of my neck and turned me toward the service stairs. "With me." I caught his sleeve before he could move. "Vittorio." His eyes darkened. "Here?" I nodded. Below us, the first beam gave way in the rear hall and the fire finally found enough air to become serious. Alessandro's gaze held mine one brutal second longer. Then he said, "One of us may not leave this house." He did not say which. He didn't need to. The roof stairs smelled like rain, old plaster, and the sweet, ugly bite of gasoline. Fire had not taken the whole house yet, but it had chosen its corners. Smoke pooled low in the landings and curled blackly along the wallpaper where generations of Romanos had framed their dead and called it lineage. My shoulder brushed the wall as Alessandro moved me upward behind him, one hand still at the back of my neck, more shield than guide. Nika limped somewhere below us, cursing men by name as shots broke out in rooms we could no longer see. At the second-floor landing, a child's portrait hung crooked over the console table. Lucia. I knew it before anything in me wanted to. The same dark eyes Alessandro carried, only unhardened. White dress, blue ribbon. Someone had left the frame there on purpose, where the stairs narrowed and memory had no room to step around itself. Bruno. Of course, Alessandro saw it in the same instant I did. His body did not stop. But something in the air around him changed less motion now, more blade. We reached the top hall under a roofline rattling in the wind. Vittorio stood by the open attic door with Bruno to his right, and the old closet room yawning behind them in smoke-striped shadow. Rain blew through a shattered dormer, carrying soot and cold into the hall. Vittorio's coat was spotless. Bruno's black wool shone wet at the shoulders where the weather found him. "I knew you'd come this way," Vittorio said. Alessandro did not answer. He positioned himself half in front of me. Not enough to block my sight. Enough to take the first bullet if that was what came. Bruno glanced at me, then at the portrait on the stairwell wall, then back to Alessandro. "You always did make the same mistake. Straight for the room." There it was. The mirror they wanted to hold up to him. Not simple evil. A man shaped by grief until strategy and obsession could no longer be told apart. Vittorio lifted one hand, the pistol low and elegant in it. "The old archives are in the attic trunk. Root books, family letters, the city judges your father bought, all of it. Stay alive and you keep the empire. Push wrong and I put a hole in the woman or the history, whichever hurts more. Smoke thickened between us and the attic door. I thought of the foyer, of Marta on the marble, of my father's stitched instructions, of the years Alessandro had kept Lucia's cardigan folded in cedar dark because grief is sometimes just love refusing new evidence. He could not choose rightly here if I let him make this only about me. So I did the one useful thing I knew. I noticed. The attic latch. Brass. Old. Slightly warped from heat. The rain through the dormer had soaked the runner by Bruno's feet, and the floorboards there shone darker. Vittorio stood dry by the open door. He had planned for Alessandro to rush, for emotion to outrun architecture. I said, before fear could ruin my timing, "The latch sticks." Every head turned to me for half a second. That was enough. Alessandro moved, not toward Vittorio, toward Bruno. The shot Vittorio fired went wide because Alessandro had already shifted the line. He hit Bruno low and fast, not with the gun first, but with his shoulder, driving him into the warped attic door so hard, the latch snapped backward. Bruno's pistol clattered across the floorboards and slid toward the dormer. Vittorio fired again. The bullet took a splinter from the hall rail beside my hand. I dropped. Not bravely, because wood exploded where my face had been. From the floor I saw Bruno's old fear for the first time. Not of death, of Alessandro this close. They hit the wall together. Alessandro's fist, Bruno's breath leaving, the kind of violence that had no theatrical shape left in it at all. Just terrible efficiency. Bruno clawed for the knife at his ankle. Alessandro saw the reach, trapped the wrist, and broke it with a sound I will hear in dreams. Vittorio came for me then. He must have understood that Alessandro was already past the point where words could redirect him, so he lunged not to save Bruno but to use me like leverage one last time. He caught a fistful of my dress at the shoulder and dragged me backward toward the attic threshold. I went because cloth tears before bone, but as he pulled, my fingers struck the fallen portrait frame on the runner. Lucia's glass cracked under my palm. The blue ribbon tied at the corner came free. I don't know why I grabbed it. Maybe because Alessandro's eyes had once gone dark over a cardigan kept clean in cedar. Maybe because grief recognizes its own objects under pressure. Vittorio hauled me across the threshold and into the attic room. Old trunks, dust, smoke. One narrow window cracked to the storm, and at the center, the cedar closet door blackened long ago at the edges and restored too carefully after. A shrine to a wound. Vittorio dragged me in front of him and put the gun under my jaw. Alessandro stopped in the doorway. Bruno knelt in the hall behind him, one arm ruined, blood at his mouth, still trying to stand through hatred. "There," Vittorio said softly. "This is where you always return, Alessandro. Not to save, to repeat." Rain hissed at the window. Fire crackled somewhere below. My own pulse slammed against the gunmetal under my chin. Alessandro's face emptied, not because he felt nothing, because he felt too much to survive expression. Then Bruno laughed wetly from the hall. "I opened the service route," he said. "Not for the money, for the correction. Your father would have made you weak over that little girl." I fixed the line before he could. The whole house went still around those words. Alessandro looked at Bruno, not Vittorio. Bruno. And something ended. I saw it happen. The last thread of filial loyalty. The last lie that Bruno had betrayed him for advantage, and not conviction. This was what it cost him. Not only blood, not only years, but the final possibility that the man who helped raise him had once loved him cleanly. Vittorio felt the shift too. His grip tightened in panic, not control. I used it. I drove my heel backward into his shin and at the same time threw Lucia's blue ribbon at Alessandro. Not because a ribbon is a weapon, because it made Vittorio look. That slicker broke his line. Alessandro crossed the room in it. The gun went off. Heat scored my throat without entry. Then Alessandro was there, ripping Vittorio off me and slamming him into the cedar closet hard enough to crack the restored panel. What he did next was not rage. That would be too human, too loud. He disarmed Vittorio, then put him on his knees with one movement and one bullet through the thigh. Vittorio screamed. Alessandro did not blink. Bruno lunged from the hall with the knife in his left hand. I saw it. So did Alessandro. But he was half-turned, and Vittorio was still moving, so I moved first. I snatched the iron candlestick from the attic trunk top and hit Bruno across the temple with both hands. The blow barely staggered him, but it spoiled the angle enough. Alessandro turned and shot him once, center chest. Bruno hit the floorboards and did not get up. Silence followed, not peace. Just aftermath, stunned into stillness. Vittorio was crying now from the leg wound and the fear of what Alessandro's face had become. Do it, then. Alessandro looked down at him a very long time. Then he took Lucia's blue ribbon from where it had fallen against his shoe. He wrapped it once around his hand, and with that hand he caught Vittorio by the jaw and forced him to look at the cedar closet door. You liked old rooms, he said quietly. Stay in this one. He dragged Vittorio into the closet, kicked the ruined pistol out after him, and shut the door. The bolt slid home. I heard pounding once, twice, then the crackle of smoke finding cedar in the seams. Alessandro stood with his hands still on the bolt and did not move. I stared at him, at the ribbon around his hand, at Bruno's body, at the closet door where a man was beginning to scream in earnest. There are things you cannot unsee. This became one of mine. Nico's voice came up the stairs hoarse with smoke. Boss! Roof's going. Alessandro turned away from the closet at last. The man who did it was not the same one who had walked in. Maybe that was victory. Maybe it was cost. He came to me and touched my throat where the bullet heat had scored a bright red line under the skin. His fingers shook once. Only once. Then he took my hand. We ran. The attic roof gave way behind us as we hit the stairwell. Rain came in through the split timbers. Men shouted below. Smoke chased us all the way to the front hall and out into the storm where fire trucks were finally arriving too late to matter to anyone we loved. In the street, under rain and ash and red light, Alessandro looked back once at the house that had built him and broken him, and watched the upper windows collapse inward. Then he said, not to me, not to the city, maybe not to anyone living. It is over. The first week after the fire smelled like antiseptic, wet wool, and lilies people sent when they did not know what else to do with violence. Marta recovered in the North Wing guest suite with her arm in a sling and enough impatience to qualify as a second illness. Nico moved more slowly than he pretended and swore every time someone noticed. The old city house became a black shell on a closed street, and the papers printed 2 paragraphs about an electrical fault in a condemned property because Chicago has always preferred a lie that lets it keep breakfast down. Bruno was buried without ceremony in a cemetery, too cold for May. Vittorio died in the cedar dark he chose for himself. Nothing about that felt clean. The empire held because men like Alessandro do not survive long enough to inherit broken kingdoms unless they know how to staple them together under fire. Routes were reassigned, judges reapproached, dock captains replaced. There was mourning, yes, but it happened in motion espresso cups cooling beside ledgers, condolences delivered with pistols still under jackets, and me. I stayed. Not because I had nowhere else. That was the point I had finally learned to make honestly. My mother's rehab suite was paid for and safer than it had ever been. I had enough cash in a box to rent a small apartment and disappear into hymns and invoices if I wanted. Rosa's cousin in Milwaukee, Marta, kept correcting me that there was no Rosa. Only women better organized than me would have taken me in without a question. I stayed because when the house burned and Alessandro came out of it with Lucia's ribbon around his hand, I saw not only what his world had made him, but what he had refused to let it finish making. I wanted to be the one who knew the difference. 3 weeks later, I found him in the greenhouse just after sunset. Rain had stopped. Every pane held the last gold of the sky. Lemon blossoms gave off that bright, bitter scent that always made the room feel cleaner than the rest of the house had any right to be. Alessandro stood at the potting bench with his sleeves rolled, a ledger open under one hand, not reading it. I knew that posture now. It meant the day had cost him more than he intended to show. He heard me before I reached the door. You should be eating. So should you. That almost got a smile. Almost. I crossed the brick floor slowly. My throat had healed to a faint pink line I could feel only when the weather changed. His knuckles had healed worse. One scar at the base of his thumb still looked fresh when the light caught it. The ribbon lay on the bench beside the ledger, clean now, folded carefully. I touched it with one finger dip. You kept it. He looked at the ribbon, then at me. I threw out the closet ash from under my nails 3 days ago. The truth of that sat between us for a moment. Not dramatic, heavy. I rested my hands on the bench edge. Marta says you haven't slept properly since the fire. Marta says many things. She's usually correct. She enjoys that too much. A small silence. Water ticking through old greenhouse pipes, gravel crunching once at the gates outside, my own pulse finding an inconvenient pace because he was standing too near and not near enough. Then he said, without preamble, "You can still leave." I turned to him. He was looking at the ledger, not me, which somehow made it more serious. "There's money in an account under your own name now," he said. "No family shell company, no conditions. The sewing rooms in the West Wing are yours if you want them, or a flat in the city, or nothing for me at all except the door open." My throat tightened in a completely unreasonable way. "Why are you saying this?" "Because after everything, if you stayed only because the edges closed around you too slowly to notice, I would deserve whatever that makes me." His voice had gone lower, rougher, honest enough to hurt. I said, "That sounds dangerously like conscience." He looked at me then. "Don't mock what little there is." I laughed once, softly, because if I cried immediately, he would think I was hurt, and we would lose the shape of this moment to damage control. I stepped closer, not touching yet, close enough to smell the cold night that still clung to his shirt from wherever he'd been before the greenhouse, close enough to notice the tiny looseness in his tie knot that told me he was tired beyond appearances. "I had a chance to leave," I said. "At the station, with the ticket in my hand." He went very still. "I didn't board," I continued. I turned back, not because I was trapped, because I knew if I left then, I'd spend the rest of my life pretending I chose safety, when really I chose fear. His eyes stayed on my face with that unbearable concentration he gave to things he would kill for and never name. "I'm still afraid," I admitted. "Of this house. Of what you can do. Of what I saw you do." I swallowed. "And I'm staying anyway." The greenhouse air changed, not magically, not cleanly, just enough. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and put a small ring box on the bench beside Lucia's ribbon. Plain black, almost severe. I stared at it. "This isn't apology," he said, "and it isn't absolution. I don't have either in a form worth giving." My hands had started to shake. I tucked them under my arms. "You're doing a terrible job calming me. I know." He opened the box. Inside lay a plain gold band with a line of black enamel stitched around the inside, so fine it looked almost like thread drawn through metal. "My goldsmith hated me for that detail," he said. "He said it was too small for anyone to notice. I notice small stitches. That's the problem." I laughed again, helplessly this time. He didn't kneel. Thank God. If he had, I might have broken open. Instead, he set the box down and said, "If you take this, it means I stop speaking about you as someone temporary to my house, to my men, to myself." His mouth tightened slightly. "It means I stop pretending distance is honorable." The lemon tree near the door brushed the glass in the evening breeze. Somewhere behind us, Marta shouted at a kitchen maid and Nico answered with fake innocence. No one believed. Ordinary life moving around the edge of an extraordinary question. I looked at the ring, then at Lucia's ribbon, then at the man in front of me with ash still somewhere under his skin and more care than he knew what to do with. "Yes," I said. The word came out smaller than the feeling, which was probably right. He took the ring from the box and slid it onto my finger with hands steadier than mine. When it settled into place, he touched it once with his thumb as if confirming reality by pressure. Then, he picked up the ribbon and tucked it into the box beneath the empty ring slot. For the safe, he said. I understood, not locked away from life, kept properly. When he walked me back to my room later, the corridor seemed changed, though the portraits had not moved, and the armed man at the turns still pretended not to breathe. At my door, he rested his hand against the frame above my shoulder, in an old echo of another room and another kind of enclosure. This room, he said, does not lock from the outside anymore. I looked at the new brass handle, then back at him. That, more than the ring, almost undid me. Inside, the bed was turned down, the lamp lit amber, my sewing basket waiting open on the chair where I had left it. Small things. Nearly ordinary. After everything, ordinary felt radical. 9 months into marriage, I learned that children hide in closets for all the same reasons adults do. Thunder, mostly. It rolled in off the lake just after dusk, hard enough to shake the glass in the north wing and send half the younger staff into old superstitions, and the other half into pretending not to have any. Rain lashed the windows in silver lines. The house settled around the storm with familiar groans. Somewhere downstairs, Nico argued with the supplier over tomorrow's fish delivery, as if weather itself could be negotiated. Marta supervised a pot of tomato sauce and a roast with the authority of someone who had survived gunfire and would not be bested by Basil. I was in Alessandro's dressing room with a basket of mending on the bench and one of his black shirts over my knee when I heard the closet door click. Not loud, just not empty. I looked up. For one stupid instant, every old fear I had ever owned came back with both hands. Then the closet door eased open another inch, and a little face appeared in the gap. Not Lucia, not memory, a living child with wet lashes and a lower lip trying very hard not to wobble. Carlo's sister, I said softly, Mina. She was 7 and worked no official role in the house except appearing in kitchens when pastries cooled and being impossible for Marta to truly frighten. Tonight, she wore pink socks, a borrowed nightshirt, and terror she was trying to keep dignified. Thunder, she whispered as if I might not have noticed the sky breaking apart around us. I set Alessandro's shirt aside at once. Come here. She didn't, not immediately. Children like Mina, who had learned too early that adults can be kind right up to the point of not having time, always watched for the second instruction. Another crack of thunder solved it. She bolted from the closet and collided with my knees. I pulled her into my lap on instinct and wrapped the nearest thing around her shoulders. Only after I had done it did I realize what I had grabbed. Not one of my cardigans. Not a blanket. Lucia's white cardigan, kept now in Alessandro's dressing room safe shelf rather than the old closet, wrapped in muslin and taken out sometimes on anniversaries. Sometimes for no reason either of us named. I had been airing the safe that afternoon because cedar tablets need replacing in August and grief, like wool, can mold if sealed too tightly. The hem of Mina's wet nightshirt brushed the knit. Without thinking, I lifted the cardigan higher and folded the blue ribbon that had slipped with it safely out of reach of the damp. Here, I murmured, tucking the dry shoulder of it around Mina's neck while my own sleeves took the rain from her hair. We keep this one clean. That was when Alessandro entered. He had a phone in one hand and rain on the shoulders of his coat from checking the terrace doors himself because he trusted no storm to respect architecture. He stopped in the doorway. The room changed, not with fear now. Recognition. His gaze went first to Mina curled in my lap, then to Lucia's cardigan gathered safely above the damp hem, then to the ribbon folded away from the water by my hand. For a second none of us spoke. Thunder rolled again, farther off this time. Mina looked up at him with the blunt honesty of children and asked, "Am I in trouble, boss?" Alessandro crossed the room and crouched in front of us, bringing the colder scent of rain and night with him. No. He touched Mina's hair once, very carefully. Then he looked at my hands on the cardigan. "You did it again," he said quietly. I felt heat move through me under the old knit, and the storm light, and the absurdity of being caught in tenderness by a man who used to make silence feel like judgment. "Mina was wet," I said. "That isn't what I mean. Of course it wasn't. He reached for the ribbon and tucked it farther from the damp with the same care I had used, his knuckles brushing mine. Mina's breathing slowed under the cardigan. In the hall outside, Nico's voice rose and fell with the phone call, all irritation and competence. The house smelled of rain, starch, and the tomato sauce Marta had likely threatened someone over already. Alessandro's thumb rested briefly against the inside of my wrist. 9 months, he said, almost to himself. And you still see what might be ruined before you think about your own comfort. I looked down at Mina because meeting his eyes would have been too much. That's a very severe way to compliment someone. It isn't a compliment. I glanced up then. His face had gone softer than he liked to let it. Not weak. Never that. Just open in one dangerous place. It's the reason, he said. The room seemed to hold still around the sentence. The first night in the cedar dark. My muddy hem. Lucia's little shoes. His question. How long were you planning to stay, little mouse? As if the real astonishment had not been my hiding, but what I had protected while doing it. Now, all these months later, a frightened child in my lap and his dead sister's cardigan kept dry by instinct before thought. He could name it now. So could I, maybe. Not neatly, but enough. Mina yawned against me with the absolute faith of someone who assumes the adults have solved the world. Alessandra stood and took her gently from my arms before the cardigan slipped. Come, he told her. Marta has probably made enough sauce to feed the weather. Mina nodded solemnly and put her head on his shoulder as if even thunder knew not to argue with that arrangement. At the door he looked back at me. No grand speech. No shadow on the horizon. Just the man himself, alive in the ordinary aftermath of everything we had survived. Bring the cardigan, he said. I folded Lucia's white knit and the blue ribbon into the muslin wrap with slow, careful hands. Then I followed him into the corridor where the lamps burned warm against the storm-dark windows, and the house held both its danger and its peace without lying about either. Downstairs, Marta clucked over Mina and took her to the kitchen. Nico ended his call and rolled his eyes at the thunder, as if it were merely another subcontractor failing to meet standards. Alessandro waited for me at the foot of the stairs with one hand in his pocket, and rain still drying at the collar. When I reached him, he touched the ring on my finger once, then let his hand slide down to cover mine. Not to guide, not to claim, just to keep. Outside, the storm moved farther over the lake. Inside, dinner smelled like garlic, basil, and the life that had not arrived gently, but had arrived all the same. And because some truths are worth ending simply, I will end with this. I stayed long enough to become home.